Welcome. I'm Aaron Jack to today's episode on the Aaron Jack Show, Artist to Art with Amy Goodchild today. So thank you so much for being here with Doing Good HQ. Thank you so much for being present with us today. Amy will join us shortly in just moments. So thank you for joining, and I appreciate you being here with us. With Doing Good HQ, Doing Good, the platform for you, where you can have up to 200 people on a single smart contract and 5% or more from every NFT sold goes directly to a nonprofit or charity. So let's have Amy on here. We will join here right now in a time. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Welcome.
Hi.
Hey. Congratulations on your drop.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is a really exciting one because you dropped within the last few hours.
Like 2 hours ago.
Oh my God. How do you feel having gone through that process, and how many pieces did you drop? Because we talked yesterday and you didn't know. We didn't even know how much it was going to be, or how did you decide? How did you get it? How did you come to the conclusions you came to and did what you did today?
So yeah, yesterday I was like still finishing stuff up, writing some code, looking at outputs and so on. I was adding features still as well. I think since we spoke yesterday, I added these like comments that appear in, I think it's about 7 or 8% of the outputs have those comments. So yeah, I was still working on stuff, so I hadn't decided like how many pieces it was going to be and how much it was going to be. But yeah, once I was done, I exported like a few full sets and sort of thought about the full collection. And I decided to go for a set of 256 outputs, which is the same number that I've done before on FX Hacker. So I think it's quite a nice number. And yeah, I went for 30 tears for each piece, which is a little increase on my last project. But yeah, I just felt like I was really happy with these outputs. I think they're super high quality. I know there has been quite a few sort of landscape pieces on FX Hash recently, so that I know that it's quite like a common thing, but like not to toot my own horn, but I think I really nailed something in the pieces, and yeah, there's kind of like a watercolory effect to them, and I'm just really happy with how they came out, and they're beautiful, and I worked really hard on them. So yeah, really happy with the collection. I think, yeah, we've minted about 52 out of 256 so far, so about 20% or something so far. So it's going pretty well.
Wow, that's amazing. So how much did you say they are?
30 tears. 30 tears.
30 TES. 30 TES on which blockchain? It's on Tezos, but like where can they find them? Where can they go and find
on
them?
FX Hash.
Perfect.
Yeah,
So we're live minting right as we speak. Right as we speak, we're live minting. This is really exciting, everyone, because this is the first show that we've been live minting, you know, with a recent drop on my show. So I'm excited. This is big news. This is big news, people.
Well, one thing to say about that as well is like with the live minting, like I don't know how familiar you are with kind of generative art specifically, and like sort of long form generative art on platforms like FX Hash. But the way it works is that as each piece is minted, it uses the hash from the transaction to seed the randomness in the piece. So each piece is unique. Each piece, we don't know how it's going to look until it gets minted. There's really billions of options of pieces that could come out. Some are like distinct options, like different color palettes. I think there's 7 or 8 color palettes in this piece, and there's 4 different cloud types, and there's the features like the moon and the comet, but then there's also like really more sort of the multitudes of variety and things like the placement of the clouds, the placement of the stars, placement of the trees, the shape of the trees, and so on. So really, yeah, there's like the variety is almost endless, I would say. And yeah, it's exciting that you don't know how it's going to look until you mint each individual piece. It's kind of like baseball cards or something.
Wow. So you really don't know how the whole collection is going to look until the very moment that it's sold out. Like you don't know how it looks together, how it's going to look separate. Can we see a couple of pieces?
Sure. Yeah.
All right.
Let's let me flip around my camera. So you should be able to see my screen. So this is the kind of outputs we're getting. This is actually like locally on my machine. So these ones are kind of test outputs, if you like. That one has a shooting star in, or comet, I called it in the end. I think I might have actually in the code hard-coded the color palette because all of those are coming out. I was doing some testing this morning, so it's like last minute changes. You can get a sneak peek at my code as well. This is always the coolest page of
Yeah,
the code.
show us. Show us a little bit. I don't know too much about like the behind the scenes code, but maybe you could give us coding ideas for the people who don't know code.
Okay, okay. Well, I'll show you this because it looks cool.
Okay.
These are my color palettes. So like each sort of little set, like that's one color palette. That's another color palette
Maybe you
there.
can zoom us in, like, because I really. Okay. All right. Oh,
A
interesting.
kind of green color palette, and it's called Space Invader. It's a sunset palette, which means that the undersides of the clouds are lit up in different colors. Not all of them do that. And you can see like all of these different colors here. That's why I was saying this is like the coolest one to look at because it has all these pretty colors in it.
Wow. So you're just like adding colors. How do you code it so you're like, this is the clouds. This is how it affects clouds. This is what clouds look like.
Um, well, it's complicated.
I
So
know.
like,
I just but I'm curious. I'm curious, like how you like decide the code of clouds.
yeah. So I think especially with this because it's kind of a realistic or like a realism piece, like it's figurative, it's not abstract. So I did spend a lot of time like looking at reference images. Like actually if I open my Figma here, I've got like different boards showing like sorry, I only have one hand, so because I'm holding it, so I
Right, right,
can't
right, right, right.
maybe oh yeah, there we go. Um, so yeah, you can see I've been like looking at lots of images of trees and skies and stuff like that, and like thinking about how clouds form and how trees form and like all that kind of stuff. So these are just reference images like grabbed from Google. So I spend a lot of time looking at stuff like that and thinking about how to recreate that in code. And if we look at the outputs, maybe I can talk about the clouds a little bit. So if you kind of look at this patch of cloud here, it's actually made up of probably, I don't know, around 1,000 individual little shapes, each of which the edge of it is kind of all wiggly and it's very low opacity. And the way that they're laid over each other kind of creates this sort of cloudy effect that goes across the whole canvas. So it's a lot of layering, basically.
Wow. Can you take us in like layer by layer or like show us like because I'm curious to like visually see what you're talking about because we do have the visual option here. Maybe not later, people might just be listening to it. But I'm curious to understand more about these wiggly patterns and how it came from your research into clouds and
Yeah,
trees. I'm really curious.
let me try. This may or may not work, but we'll try
That's
it. We'll do
okay.
it.
That's okay. I like that. That's why we're doing this live. We don't know whether it's gonna work.
Let me think. I'm going to try and turn up the opacity on some of them. Just trying to find the right. Here we go. Um, all right, bear with me.
Oh yeah, yeah. We're here with you. I mean, this is like you're going back into the code and changing things. I'm like
This is always a terrible idea. Like anyone who writes code is like, don't ever try and live code without exactly knowing what you're going to do, you know?
right, it
But
might
we'll
just turn out
yeah,
crazy.
exactly. Yeah, we're going to see. Oh, yeah, no, it worked. Okay. So basically what
What?
I did was I turned up the opacity on all of those shapes that I was talking about.
Okay.
Um, so now maybe you can see a little bit more about what I was saying about how they're all like wiggly individual shapes.
Oh yeah, yeah. Bring us closer. Can you zoom? Can you like get us in there? Oh, interesting.
From the screen, but
Yeah. How did your observations of clouds lead you to like forming clouds in that way?
um, I don't know. I guess I'm not sure what to say other than like looking at them and thinking about it. And the way the edges of those shapes are created is using a technique called Perlin noise, which is a way of generating random numbers that are sequentially similar. So where you'd normally generate a random number, you would get like 6, 5,000, 2, 50, like all over the place. When you generate Perlin noise random numbers, they kind of more come in a wave. So like you would get like 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you get these like wavy kind of patterns, which I have used extensively in this project and in lots of projects. And that kind of creates those wavy edges to the cloud shapes.
Wow, that's incredible. And then you said you just put this comment in.
Yes.
Wow.
I,
So what made you decide to put in the comment like last minute?
well, it was definitely something that was in my like list of things to add the whole time. And actually, like I had other things as well that that I tried out along the way that I ended up not liking. Like not everything, always works out. Like I had a mountain range option, which I spent a bit of time on over the last couple of days, and it wasn't really coming together. It wasn't looking how I wanted it to. So yeah, I discarded that, and I concentrated on the trees and adding in like variety to the trees. Um, but with the comet specifically, I think it's just nice to have like something special in some of the pieces. Like obviously with NFTs, like it's partly about like creating that rarity, but and partly that's all for like the value and of the pieces and so on. But actually, I just think it's really nice that like some of them get these comments in and some don't. Like it's a nice little, not like an Easter egg because like it's there, but it's a special thing in some of them. I think that's a really nice concept.
Yeah, what have you learned about NFTs? I mean, we haven't talked since really October of last year of 2020 and things have changed a little bit, I'm sure in your process and NFTs have become a thing.
Yeah,
So many. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember exactly when we spoke. I don't know if I'd even started looking into NFTs then, or I mean, I'm sure I was aware of them, but I don't know if I'd actually started creating them at that time. So yeah, I don't know. It really has changed the landscape of generative art a lot, and I mean of a lot of art as well, but particularly generative art, I think, because it does lend itself so well to NFTs with like that thing that I was talking about of being able to use the hash to seed the randomness of the piece. Like I think that's a really cool thing, like to create a way to make art. So yeah, it lends itself to it well. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's a really exciting time. Like I just think like no one knows what's going to happen. Like oftentimes my friends ask me like people that aren't so into NFTs or so up on it or whatever, but they know that I am, and they're like, "What do you think is going to happen? Like, is it going to go forever? Is the market going to crash? Like, what?" And nobody really knows. But like, I can't see it going away anytime soon. Like, I think there's a lot of negativity out there, but I think a lot of that is like ignoring a lot of the good stuff. A lot of the charity work, like you were mentioning, that's going on. Like a lot of the big platforms really encourage artists to give like large amounts of money to charity. Like I've given away portions of sales before to charities. Like there's a lot of good going on there. Um, and obviously like the benefits for the artists are like immeasurable. Like I've been able to I do this full time at the moment, and like I say, like who knows how long that will go on or whatever, but yeah, it's like been life changing really.
Wow, so this really changed your life as an artist, and creative, and gave you an income, a way to support yourself in a new way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I like I've been making art for years, you know, even before I got into generative art in sort of early 2020. Like I used to make interactive installations, which I think we spoke a lot about last time. And I like poured money into that over the years. You know, I worked past tense as a UX designer, like for my day job, and I was, you know, earning money doing that and taking a lot of time off and pouring money into art, which, you know, that was a choice, and I was lucky even that I was able to do that, to have a job that enabled me to make the art that I was. But it certainly wasn't sustainable for me to make art full time, and I couldn't really see a path for how it could become sustainable, and that has just completely flipped around in the last, I don't know, less than 12 months even. So yeah.
Wow. So how have you seen it change not only your lives, but the people around you? Because you must know other people that this has affected in a pretty big way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, mostly people that I know online, I guess, because there's a big like generative art community, and I mean like art community in general around NFTs, and particularly like there's a Slack group that I'm in that's for generative artists, and I mean I joined that like pre NFTs, and that whole group has changed a lot because there's so many people in there that are selling NFTs and have been like experiencing um, success and yeah, changing their lives as well. So yeah.
Well, maybe you could talk about that, because I know that there's a lot of artists and creatives out there, and maybe even collectors watching this, or future collectors watching this. What would you say to them, when they haven't really delved into the NFT landscape yet, or they're hesitant, or they're not sure where to go? What would you say to them in terms of your own journey and how you approached it, as a creative?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good question. I would say like keep an open mind, um, because there obviously like there's no point trying to hide the fact that there is negativity out there, and there are pros and cons to NFTs. Like I'm not denying that at all, but I do think that there is kind of this wave of content that's like just focusing on those negatives, and I think that that stuff is getting a lot of um, like airtime, for want of a better word. And I think that it's very easy to like dump on cryptocurrency and NFTs, and like, and partly that's because there are bad things about it, and like we need to not ignore that, and we need to try and work on those issues and so on. But that doesn't mean that there aren't also positives. And I think those positives can't be ignored, and well, those positives are really valuable as well. So um, yeah, and it also, yeah, the reason I would say keep an open mind is because I would say my initial reaction was negative. Like, I didn't understand why people would want to buy an NFT, and I was skeptical. I mean, I'm talking like about a year ago now. Like, I was quite skeptical in the beginning. Um, and then, yeah, just the more I read about it, the more I started like collecting NFTs myself as well on Hicket Nunk. So I got that sense of like, actually I do want to own this thing, and it's nice for me to partly just to own it, and partly also to feel like I've supported the artist. Like for me, that's a huge part of it, and I know that is a big part of it for a lot of collectors as well, is to feel like you've um, yeah, supported an artist, like similar to like supporting someone's Patreon or something, which is a thing that I do as well. Um, yeah, it's just a nice thing to do, I guess. And then there's that whole other side as well of like, it's nice to own something, and I do get that a lot more now than I did in the beginning. And I think it's very easy to kind of yeah, dump on it. Or I mean, it's always been that way in art in general. Like, it's very easy to be like, oh, modern art, like my kid could do that, like all that kind of stuff. Like, there's a very easy criticisms, and I think that um, they're not very valid in a lot of cases, and they're not very interesting. And I think there is a lot of interesting stuff there that gets ignored a lot of the time.
Wow. So past all this kind of negative press that it's getting, what got you kind of going from like, I'm skeptical to saying, okay, maybe I'll give it a try, or let's see what more, what kind of things did you see and people you met along the way that changed that for you?
Yeah, I definitely say it was the people. Like that generative art Slack kind of community that I mentioned. A lot of people in there started doing NFTs, and someone messaged me specifically to like invite me to a certain platform, and they were like encouraging me to get involved. So that felt like I mean, it's partly it's just nice to like have your work sort of acknowledged in a way, and for someone to say like I would like to see your work in this medium and in this platform. So that made me want to get involved. And I started out on Hiket Nunk, which is a Tezos platform as well. Um, and yeah, just as soon as I started putting work on there, and you know, partly it's about the money, and like yeah, I can support myself this way, and like you know, it's that's great. But it's also about knowing that somebody wants to own my work. Like the thrill and the high of like selling work is like incomparable. I mean, I would say it's comparable to like when I used to make installation art like pre-pandemic, and I was able to like go into those installations and see people enjoying them. And that's pretty much all. I actually wrote a blog article about this. It's like all I want in life is to like make things and have other people look at those things and be like, cool, you know. And NFTs gives a way to do that. Like I make the stuff and like I'm people are buying it because they want to own it, and it helps build my platform. And like all I really want is to yeah people to look at the things I've made and to like them. So it enables that.
And it does it in a very different way, it seems, than you would be able to make any income from what you've been doing before. Because I know last time we talked, which it is basically a year and a half ago, which before we, I don't know, I never heard the term non-fungible before February of last year, February 1st of last year that I know of, that I remember. So what in that period you went from like t-shirts and installations and going in 50 million directions, and it seems like you've built some focus in this direction. um yeah, I just want to know about that, like that transition between like trying a million things as an artist and then finding a way that people could connect more deeply to your art in a way that made sense for you.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, it's kind of interesting that you kind of piece it together that way, because that's certainly always how I felt, is like I'm trying out all these kind of different things. Like, I mean, I even like I used to do stand-up comedy, and so I had that whole side as well. And you know, obviously that's a different thing, but it's an art form in some ways. And then there was I did my undergraduate degree was actually photography, so I've had photography exhibitions and of all of like different types. So yeah, my art history and my background in general has been quite like uh, I don't know, yeah, explorative, I guess is is the positive way to put it. Like trying out lots of different things. And yeah, it's interesting now to think about like having gained some focus, because I think part of me still like, yeah, we'll see. Like maybe I'll, you know, especially now that we're kind of coming out of the pandemic, like fingers crossed, and festivals are starting to happen again. Like I'm sure I will want to go back to making that physical art again as well. Like I don't think that that's over for me. Um, but this having the NFT side of things means that perhaps it's sustainable to make installation art funded through NFTs, also to, you know, combine those things a little bit. Just on a practical sense, it makes it more doable financially.
That's very interesting. So, what would you say to artists who are just kind of like getting into this? You know, whether they're emerging artists, mid-career, or later career artists. What would you say to each of those groups um, for exploring NFTs and how to maybe start to approach it?
Um, I guess I would say like, I mean, part of me is like, I don't know, you know, like who am I to be giving that kind of advice, or whatever. But I guess just as a like from my position, I would say it's really important to not forget about the art. Like the art has to come first. And I would never describe myself as like an NFT artist or like that. It's not, the NFTs don't come first. You know, it's like you wouldn't 10 years ago. I don't know that people would describe themselves as like a gallery artist or whatever. Like it's that's not how it works. It's a platform and it's a medium for sales. It's not a medium for artwork, in my opinion. And that does get a little bit fuzzy because of this whole thing about we're incorporating the hash into the output, and that's cool. But I think it's really important to think about the art first. And I do even like I've had people sort of hear about the success in NFTs and say like that I've had, and they're like, oh, how did you do it? Like, how do I learn to code? I want to get into generative art, and they don't want to get into generative art. they want to get into like selling NFTs because they hear that it's like an easy thing to do and that you can kind of click a button and generate art and whatever. And that's really not the case. And I think if that's your mindset, it's not going to work out for you. I think you have to be interested to make the art first and foremost, and then the NFTs and the selling it is kind of a supportive thing, I guess.
I think that's a really amazing point. That's so looked over in the greater communities that I've seen, and I'd like to focus a little bit more on that as the NFTs are just a holder, basically, right? They're just a way for that thing, just like you said, Patreon or things like
Mm-hmm.
that. It's a way to support the art itself. And what would you say in terms of like artists knowing that just because they're into NFTs, that the art isn't a secondary matter, that it's based around the that if you think about the art first, that there's something to that, and NFTs aren't gonna change that, right? Are
Mm-hmm.
they? Are they? Oh,
Yeah, I, I don't think so. I mean, in some ways, certainly like the profile of generative art has been raised because of NFTs recently. I mean, generative art has been around for, you know, decades, but it feels like it's having kind of a moment right now. And I think that is not entirely because of NFTs, but it's at least in part because of NFTs. And in some ways, that's great because it's bringing more people to the medium. And a lot of those people are hearing what generative art is and thinking, oh, wow, that sounds cool. Like, what would happen if I did this? What would happen if I did that? And I'm going to learn to code and, you know, all kinds of things. And that's cool. But then, there's also those people who are hearing, oh, cool, you can make money really easily. And I just don't think that that's really the case. You know, I think I and a lot of other generative artists have been doing some form of art for years and kind of building that following and stuff. I kind of forgot what the question was. Sorry.
well, I think this is a really good point that it's that you and a lot of other generative artists have been doing it for years and just now, and you've been building a following and community and people around the art itself. It's not just like all these people didn't spring out of the blue and are like all of a sudden buying your artwork because of the NFTs, right?
No, no, no. I mean, definitely my following has grown in the last like year or whatever, more quickly than it was before. But I've also had more time to put into the art, so you know that's why. And even, I mean, I'm a complete like noob to generative art, really, like in the grand scheme of things. You know that there are people that have been at this for literally decades, and I certainly, I'm sure I look to them like I just kind of wandered in the door, you know. Um, but yeah, I think my mindset is very much about being interested in what generation is and how we can use machines and sets of rules and randomness and all that kind of stuff to create interesting work, but interesting visually and interesting conceptually as well. And I think, yeah, that's the important thing to remember, is that it's about the art first.
I like that, art first. I like that as a way to go about it. Um, there's a couple things in here that I'd like to touch on. We're talking about the generation, the rules, the randomness, the concept. What Where do you go with that, with the generative art, with these ideas, and how do you push the boundaries? And yeah, tell me about your process about dealing with it, because rules and generative work, it's a little bit different from putting a paint to a canvas. Um, but there's different conceptual elements that are involved. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I actually wrote a really long blog article about it just a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, if anyone wants to know more after I ramble about it now, then yeah, go and check that out. It's just literally called "What is Generative Art?" But I kind of came up with this loose model that there are really like three sort of pillars, I guess, of generative art. And one is randomness, and then one is rule-based systems, and then the third is natural systems. So thinking about randomness, like the easiest way to do it, it's by, in P5.js or any other kind of coding platform or language or framework, you can generate a pseudo random number by typing in like random and brackets, and it will give you a random number, and then you can use that number to do things like decide, the shape of my clouds in skyscapes, or decide like how many branches are on a tree or how tall the tree is. When you build up all that randomness, you can create incredibly varied and beautiful pieces. And then coming on to the second thing that I mentioned, so systems of rules. And one example of this would be work like Sol LeWitt, who created these works where the actual work is a list of instructions. So it'll be something like, take a large wall, draw 50 dots on the wall, and then connect all of those dots together. Like I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something like that. And that's the actual artwork, is the list of instructions. And then obviously, like over time, lots of people have implemented those instructions with like different outputs. And then obviously rules is something that we use in coding a lot, like algorithms. Like an algorithm is just a list of rules. So do this and then do that and then do this other thing. Like there's a piece that I use as an example in my article, which is a Casey Rios piece, I think, where I think it was a pen plotted work where he generated, I think, 3 different angles, and then so he would draw red lines at one angle, green lines at another angle, and blue lines at another angle, and each piece, like those angles are different. So it's a really simple algorithm, like draw 3 sets of lines, pick an angle for them, pen plot it. But the different effects that creates, where the different lines kind of overlay each other, produces really interesting results. And then the third thing I mentioned was natural systems. So first of all, you can create generative art literally by like isolating a natural system. Like one example is a condensation cube. I think the artist is Hans Hacker. And it's literally a perspex cube which has a small amount of water in. And over time, condensation builds up inside the cube, which obviously is a natural system that's occurring everywhere, but he's kind of elevated it to the artwork. And to me, that is generative. Like it's a generative system because it's not under control of any human. Like the natural world is creating that condensation. And then on the other side, natural systems are often used in generative art because we like to simulate them often. So kind of at one end of the scale, there's things like skyscapes where I'm on a very aesthetic level, simulating the real world, like creating clouds and so on. But then at completely the other end of the scale, you can get a very scientific simulation. I can't remember the name of the scientist who did it, but there's it's mentioned in my article. There's a couple of scientists who created like a snowflake simulation, and it's literally based on the science of how snowflakes form, and by varying different things like I don't know, humidity and temperature and so on, you can see how different snowflakes would form. Yeah, and by combining all of those things, and a bunch of other stuff as well, which didn't quite fit into my kind of system. Yeah, I think that's kind of the basis of what generative art is to me anyway.
Well, what are a few things that didn't fit into your system that you might like to include in the future as you write more articles? And what are things that you're thinking about where generative art is going, and what you see are kind of like the outliers that you're like, well, I haven't quite thought about this fully yet.
Yeah, yeah. I actually there's a whole section at the end of my article where I go into that. I'm going to check it rather than rely on my memory of what what I included in here. Oh yeah, so using like data sources as an input, like instead of randomness, using things like flight patterns or a person dancing with like trackers on them, using that as like an input for generation. Um, AI and machine learning, that feels like it's kind of it sits alongside generative art to me, but it feels like a very different thing. But like equally as interesting. Oh, this is an interesting one. So there's a technique that the surrealists developed, which is called automatic drawing or automatic writing, where the idea is that the artist or the person like holds a pen and allows it to move randomly across the page, like trying to tap into their subconscious or um, for some people it was considered like a way of communicating with the spirit world, like in a seance. There's an artist called Hilma af Klint who I absolutely love her work, and that was how she developed a lot of her pieces. So I think kind of tapping
I
into
love,
either the
I
sorry.
love her work. I love her
Okay.
work. Okay, continue on. I just needed
Yeah,
to just like do that.
shout out. um yeah, so I think that like when you're tapping into like whether you want to call it the subconscious or like the spirit world or or whatever, kind of it's not under direct human control. So I think that that could be considered generative as well. And then that kind of leads on to even work like Jackson Pollock, where he's not in tight control of the forms on the canvas. Like he's throwing paint and he's moving freely and he's in the moment and so on. So it kind of it's only a little step on from that kind of automatic drawing in my mind anyway. And then you start to think, well, surely every painting has some element of that, like an artist isn't in complete control of the paint at any point. So it starts to feel more like a gradient of generative to non-generative rather than like two buckets of generative and non-generative. There's a gradient there, which I find really interesting.
Well, that's really interesting. I'd love to hear more a matter, in this matter of between the automatic drawing and how that relates to the rules in you know, generative work inside the computer, how the very tactile in your mind relates to the very code and rules that can often feel to people very non-tactile.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, I think if I go back to the kind of the beginning of my article, the sort of definitions that I laid out at the start was that generative art is art created using an autonomous process, and on an autonomous process is one that is not under direct human control. So it's about finding ways of creating something without being completely in control of it. And then there are like different ways that you can do that. And one is to use a computer to generate a random or pseudo random number. And another is to, close your eyes and be with the spirits, like they obviously they're very different things, but it's about tapping into something outside of yourself and using that as an input for some kind of creation. And I think then there's all this I find really interesting on the randomness side as well, is that I've kind of mentioned this a couple of times, that actually random numbers that we use most of the time in generative art are pseudo-random. So they are created by an algorithm. We give the algorithm a seed. So like on FX Hash or on Art Blocks, the seed is the hash from the transaction on the blockchain. And that hash then spits out random numbers. But if you give it the same hash, it's always going to give you the same random numbers. So it's actually not random, it's deterministic. And the only way to create true random numbers is to use some kind of chaotic system, like looking at weather patterns or atmospheric noise, that kind of thing, or looking at, I can't remember what the word is, like radioactive deterioration or radioactive, I can't think of the word, but like looking at kind of radioactive material and seeing how it decays, that's the word. And there's this idea that that stuff is actually random, whereas the pseudo-random numbers are only pseudo-random. But in fact, even those kind of chaotic systems are only random if we assume that we're living in a non-deterministic universe, which perhaps we're not. Perhaps everything that's ever happened is a direct result of the things that have gone before, even at a cellular or microscopic or atomic level. And I think, as I understand it, quantum physics would say that that's not the case, and that things are random because there's chaotic movement at a quantum level. But I think we don't know, and I think that's really interesting. Not to get too like into it, you know.
No, I think you should get into it. I think this is the space to get into it. Here at the Aaron Jack Show, we'd like to get into welcome. Welcome to another episode, another day. Why not? We'll bring on a quantum physicist next. Why don't you find the quantum physicist, and then then the three of us will have a chat.
Yeah, I've actually found a quantum physicist. So when I was writing this article, the What is Generative article, I started to get into this whole discussion in my head and in my writing of like randomness and pseudo-randomness and quantum mechanics. And I was like trying to do some research and things weren't quite making sense. And I thought, okay, I'm going to put this aside and put it into a different article, which I still plan to write in the next, like, I don't know, couple of months. And I actually found a quantum physicist on Twitter who has agreed to speak to me and try and explain things to me. So then I'll write an article about it.
Very interesting. So you draw a lot of inspiration from different places, and I think as there's a lot of people who call themselves NFT artists, and not to say that's a bad thing, but to say there's something to that you've been at it for such a long time, and that it's more than just creating these random fun things. There's something you're exploring here. There's something that you're really going to, seeing that's beyond the surface. And I think that's really important to discuss, is what you found out beyond the surface as being able to implement these ideas in quantum physics and these ideas that you've found in the universe, and understanding the deterministic or non-deterministic ways of the universe and how you're able to implement that in your code. Maybe you could share a little bit more of what you're finding as you've been able to implement these aspects into your code, and what kind of outputs you've learned for your own experimental mindset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think in general, I would say that I've like discovered just more questions and like more things to ask than I've discovered any answers, and I feel like my job or my role or whatever as an artist is not really to answer questions, but to pose them in an interesting way and to like explore things. Like I'm not a scientist, so I'm not I'm experimenting, but I'm not looking to like find a empirical conclusion. I'm just exploring and being like, hey, look at this, that's interesting, which is, I think, a brilliant position to be in. But yeah, I think I've definitely discovered questions or like things to be interested in. And I think that whole question of how things are formed and how things are generated in the real world versus like by a computer in an artwork. I find that really interesting, and I think that there's like, even in Skyscapes, the project that I dropped this morning, in some ways, like just the really, it's like there's a simplicity to the algorithms that I'm using to create the clouds and the trees and so on. But at first glance, I think it could be a photo. Like when you look closely, you can absolutely see that it's generated, and that's deliberate. And in some cases, like I've left in artifacts that are, hard edges and so on. But the similarity in some ways of the forms that are created just with like random numbers and Perlin noise and wiggly lines and so on, makes me think that, I don't know, maybe something's happening there. Like it's hard to put the thought together, but something about how things are created in the real world and how they're created in the artwork sometimes makes me think that maybe those two things aren't that different. And I guess what I'm alluding to is like the idea that we live in a simulation and that nothing is real. And I'm not saying that I necessarily believe that or that that's my position, because I don't have any answers, but I find the idea and the question interesting. So, yeah.
Does that make the artwork any less real?
Um, well, I guess if nothing's real, then yeah. I don't know. I don't know what you mean.
Well, like, just because it's based on a set of rules,
Mhm.
like the artwork is based on a set of rules, and you're finding similarity between rules that exist inside what you could imagine and rules that exist outside of what you can imagine, right? Um, that they're aligning more and more. Does that mean that the physical world, or as we talk here, this digital connection wouldn't be real if it's based on a set of rules?
Um, I don't know. It almost becomes a semantic argument about what is real. And if it is the case that everything that we see and experience is constructed in a less natural way than we expect, that's still all we have, and therefore we may as well refer to it as reality, I think. Um, and in a way, if that is true, then the the art that I'm making or the art that a lot of generative artists are making is equally real, because we've established that creating things by a series of rules is a real way to create things. Does that make sense? I'm kind of like talking as I'm thinking.
Well, I think that's really interesting that it's kind of like proving itself to you as you make it, that because you're creating it, it exists. And because creation exists, therefore it becomes real to you and to other people.
Yeah, it's like I think, therefore I am, right? It's the same principle. It exists, therefore it is. I don't know. We've gone deep. We've gone deep.
But I think this is a really interesting point. As we create art, it's like the power of creation, the power within each of us. And what does that mean to each of us as we have the power to create? You know, from the meal to the rules and the sets of rules to the cookbook of it all. Um,
Mhm.
the, what does it mean to create the meal? What does it mean to create the cookbook with a set of rules? And how do we relate to generative art? How do we relate to any art? And as we create it or as we observe it, how do we allow it to change us? Is there an element that as you create the work that you make, it changes you?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like it changes my ways of thinking. And I think as well, there's something really interesting to talk about when you think about behavior. So there's quite a like well-known algorithm or like technique or whatever called flocking, which is used in a lot of generative art. There's a really good tutorial on the coding train about implementing flocking. And it's basically when you have a system of creatures, let's say they're birds, and each one is moving around somewhat randomly, but they're also aligning themselves with all of the other birds. They're avoiding crashing into all of the other birds, and they're getting somewhat close to all the other birds. And just based on those three behaviors, if you code them into a system, you can set that system running, and you can have like 50 birds on your screen, and they look like they're moving in an incredibly organic, real way. Like you could convince someone that it was birds had been tracked and filmed, and that's what you were showing them. And so when we think like, okay, birds are acting in some way in accordance with a system of rules like that to avoid crashing into each other and to create like a flock of birds. And certainly when we kind of go down the complexity scale, we can talk about the rules that things like slime mold operate under. And we can really quite accurately define what those rules are. But then if you go in the opposite direction all the way up to like human behavior, is that also just a system of rules? And like, are we just operating under like, if this happens, then I will do this, and if this happens, then I will do this? Or is there something more complex going on? And if it is more complex, where does that come from, and in what way is it complex? And does that complexity just come out of the rules, or does it come from somewhere else? I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Well, I think this is this is a thing that I think psychologists and philosophers and different people get into, and I think it's really fascinating to look at sociologists get into different sets of rules that humans follow. And as we look at these different studies, what sorts of rules overlay how things work, how we work, how the universe works. And I think it's really interesting is your explorations of how does the universe work as you simulate aspects of trees, of clouds, of your own imagination and observations within them. And that's, I guess, where I'm very curious is what you've learned about trees and clouds as you've started to understand them more and more and recreated rules that they exist upon. What sort of rules exist that make up trees and clouds that that you've observed?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I would say that I'm coming to it from a very aesthetic perspective. Like I'm not considering how the clouds form by like water vapor evaporating and humidity and all that kind of stuff. Like that's not my process or my focus. And there's certainly a place for that in art as well. Like I think a lot of people do look at things more from that perspective and create artworks out of it. But even from an aesthetic perspective, like looking at clouds and looking at trees and thinking about like how is the shape formed in a way that I could recreate with rules, it is surprising and delightful to me how frequently you can create something that looks at least somewhat close to real using a system of rules. So I guess the discovery is that it makes me think that these rules are like underpinning everything, and that's interesting.
But you're also looking at the light. You're not just looking at the formations, right? And that you're looking at color palettes. You're looking at other aspects of these clouds as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting with the color as well, because really what I'm thinking about color from almost a photographic perspective. Like I think about how would this look in a photograph more than I think how would this look in real life. Because I'm not going to draw, like if you look at the trees in skyscapes, there is variation in the color, but it's all incredibly dark colors because the trees are silhouetted. But obviously when we think about trees, like we think their leaves are green and their trunks are brown, but that's not how I've colored them in the pieces, because that's not how they would look in a photograph. So it's it's still very much from a visual perspective more than a like accurate scientific perspective.
Well, I think that's very interesting that when looking at it, it's like, how do we view these things? Is it through the senses, or is it, directly as it's as it as it quote unquote is, or as it's observed? And I think it's really interesting that you're looking at the rules here, at particularly as these elements of nature are observed through the senses,
Hmm.
um, and you're able to and the ability to be like, oh, this is how I would view it after because I observed it in a particular way. And I'm very curious about that because so much of simulations, from a scientific point of view, would be like, this is how the rock is, this is how the tree is, and you're saying this is how the tree is observed through the
Hmm.
rules. It would seem to me, right? I mean,
Yeah.
tell me if I'm wrong here, but
No,
it seems to me.
I don't think I'd like crystallize that thought myself, but yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, it's about definitely how it's observed, not how it is. Yeah.
So, as we look at like the senses as the senses observe these objects in nature, um, what have you learned about sensory perceptions that make you write the code in a particular way, that it's more a matter of observation? Yeah, just more a matter of observation. What have you particularly thought about or considered in that, from that standpoint?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of that two ways of doing things thing again, where there's one way that you can like look at it from an aesthetic perspective and create what you see, and there's the other way where you could think about at a physical or atomic or whatever level, like how is this formed, and you can try and simulate that. Um, and I find it interesting that both of those things produce equally valid and beautiful results, but often in a different way. There's actually an example in my What is Generative Art article, where I'm looking at snowflakes, and I'm trying to see if I can find it now. See if I can control snowflakes. Yeah. So there's two different projects here, like on the left and on the right. So these are all outputs from a little project called Snowflaker, which produces these like little, I think they're SVG outputs, and like each one looks like a snowflake. It's the kind of thing that you could, use to cut out snowflakes to stick on your wall at Christmas or whatever, that kind of thing. And then on the other side over here, are these snowflakes that are created by these two scientists, Gravner and Griffith. And they were actually generated by modeling the crystal growth under different conditions. So they have all these sliders where you can control things like temperature and humidity and, all kinds of stuff. And you can see like immediately like the difference in the resolution on each of these, and the detail is obvious. Each has their place, and each is valid. Like this is more scientific, this is more aesthetic. This has extra layers of depth to the interest. And I think that there's something to be said for perhaps combining those things a bit more, and I think that is something that a lot of generative artists are doing and are exploring, with all different kinds of algorithms, based on, I don't know, slime mold and diffusion and all kinds of like scientific phenomena that can be simulated, and then once you've simulated that model, you can look at ways to create things that are more aesthetic, using it. I think it's just a really what's the word, like a ripe area for exploration at the moment. I think like there's a lot to do.
Wow, wow. We've got so much more to get into, but we're here wrapping up our hour, or so, whatever it is. uh, Something like that. So, but I wanna give you some, a chance. First, I'm gonna say thank you to our audience, wherever, whenever our audience is. Uh, I'm Aaron Jack. This is the Aaron Jack Show. Thank you for hosting us with Doing Good HQ, where you can mint on the Polygon blockchain with up to 200 people on a smart contract, and 5% or more of every NFT goes to a nonprofit or charity. So make sure to follow, like, subscribe, lick, tweet, jump, whatever it is. I don't know what you do. Twist, bop it, whatever. Bop it, twist it, spin it, whatever. Click it. So I'm Aaron Jack. At Aaron Jack Lineart on Instagram, at I am Aaron Jack 1 on Twitter, that Twitter thing. And Amy, tell me where everybody can find you. Spell it out for us, and then we'll give you some last words, and we'll wrap it up.
Sure. So on Instagram, I'm Amy underscore Goodchild. And then on Twitter, it's just Amy Goodchild, no underscore. The inconsistency is the bane of my life, but there we go. If you search for Amy Goodchild, I should come up in both. Um, Also, my website is www.amygoodchild.com. So yeah, if you want to check out that blog article that I've been talking about, so yeah, have a look at the blog there. It's about 3,500 words. It's kind of a long read to kind of grab a cup of tea and make your way through. But yeah, it's had some good feedback. So I think it's an interesting read.
Perfect. And we're, if you're watching this in synchronistic time, because we can look, we've explored time on this episode, on this, not on this episode, but on episodes in the past, time, synchronous and asynchronous time. We're live minting right now Amy's work. So if you're in synchronous time, maybe you can buy it on the primary market. And if not, maybe you can buy it on the secondary. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? So thank you so much, Amy, for being here. Thank you to our audience. Why don't you give us some last words? Anything that from your heart you want to share with the world? Some thoughts, ideas that you would like to share, anything else, and then press the X button when you're done.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say thank you for having me on, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I feel like, yeah, we've gone deep, and I think that there's a lot there. And I'm like so grateful that I get to spend my life like exploring stuff like this and making art out of it, making art that involves thinking about this kind of stuff. And yeah, like I said, I think there's still so much to explore and so much to try out, and I'm excited about the coming months and years of making stuff. And that's it, I think. Should I just hit the X?
Wow. Wow. I just want to say wow and thank you for joining, because I really appreciate you being on with me again and further exploring these concepts and sharing and just really being here. So thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you as well. Bye.
So thank you so much to our audience today. Thank you, Amy, for being here. Again, I'm Aaron Jack at Aaron Jack Lineart on Instagram. And today we've explored so many concepts from and through generative art, NFTs, what it is to go through the randomness rules and the natural systems, to quantum physics, and how does that impact art making and creation and building building conceptual models, how we view things in the world, our senses versus scientific, or is it scientific? How do we use our senses to observe the world? And are there rules behind all of the things that we see, all of the things that we feel, sense, taste, smell? And how are they observed? How do we take this world between as it is and observe it through rules, and how are we as humans interacting with it? I think we get these basic questions. um, it's interesting, and I think this is, part of what it means to be an artist. This, this play, the science, the observation, the rules, the understanding, the randomness. Is there something outside of ourselves? These questions. That's why I'm here, to understand with you. So thank you for being here and understanding the world with me on the Aaron Jack Show. I really appreciate it. Um, really appreciate it. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here on the quantum episode. Whether we existed or not existed is up to you, the viewer who observed, who thought. And if you thought, then you know the rest. Till the next time, thank you so much.